everybody. I'm Natasha Kirchuk, and thanks for joining us for ILTV's weekly program, One-on-One with Alan Dershowitz. We want to give you, our viewers, the chance to have your questions answered by Professor Dershowitz, one of America's greatest legal minds. He's a leading expert on criminal and constitutional law, civil liberties, and the Arab-Israeli conflict. Hi, Professor Dershowitz. It's so great to see you again.
It's great to see you again. You're a great host.
Thank you. I couldn't have a better person to be interviewing, so let's get started. So, Professor, as you know, for each show, we'll be joined by a special guest. Our last show opened with a question from Colonel Richard Kemp, a former commander of the British forces in Afghanistan. This week, our show has an international flavor, and we're honored to have Ambassador Danny Ayalon, who was also the former Deputy Foreign Minister of Israel. He has a more personal question for you. Let's hear what he has to say.
Dear Ellen, Mazal Tov, congratulations on your new show on ILTV, a very important show as Israel continues to face BDS and delegitimization campaigns, and you are the best one to answer all the difficult questions and to equip all the listeners with the right answers to defend Israel in the best way. I have one question for you, and that is, if you recall, 5 years ago, I came on behalf of Prime Minister Netanyahu in a very confidential mission to meet you and offer you the job of Israel's envoy to the United Nations, Israel's ambassador to the United Nations. Unfortunately, you didn't take this offer. And my question to you is, why didn't you take the job?
Well, Danny, thank you so much. You have been one of Israel's greatest spokespersons, your wife as well, in her efforts to get the Christian community to remain supportive of Israel. You've done fantastic work on behalf of Israel and the Jewish people. Danny, when you came to see me in Miami Beach, Florida, you presented me with one of the hardest decisions of my life. I would have loved to do nothing more than to stand in the well of the United Nations on behalf of the nation state of the Jewish people. Nothing would have given me more pleasure, more pride. I think I would have done a good job in defending Israel in front of the international community. But my own feeling was that there are so many superb Israelis who could do the job effectively. When I didn't take the job, it was given to Ron Prasar, who did a fantastic job. That all things being equal, I think it'd be far better for an Israeli to represent Israel at the United Nations. I also worried that it might raise the specter in the United States of dual loyalty. I am an American. I was born in Brooklyn of parents who were born in the United States, grandparents who came over from the shtetls of Poland, and I'm a patriotic and loyal America. And if ever there were a situation, and there might be one this very year, where the United States and Israel take diametrically opposing points of view, the United States may not veto the French proposal this year to impose a peace on Israel, which I think would be terrible for peace, terrible for the peace process. As an American, I would be accused of a dual loyalty, and it might hurt the Jewish community in America. I think the situation is different depending on the job. When an American citizen was made the head of the Bank of Israel, that was different. That's a kind of technical job. Or when Elie Wiesel was offered the position of president of Israel, or Albert Einstein, again, the presidency of Israel is a symbolic job that basically is the presidency of the Jewish people around the world. But to represent a country at the UN requires, I think, that you give up your loyalty to one country and adopt it completely to another country. And I was concerned about that. Look, in the end, it turned out very good for everybody, because Ron Prasar did a fantastic job at the United Nations. And I think that Israel was and continues to be well represented in that terrible place where terrorism is rewarded, democracy is punished, and doublespeak is the language of the day. So thank you, Danny, for all your work on behalf of Israel, and thank you for being the one to offer me that job on behalf of the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister, and for making my life so difficult by putting me in the position to have to make that terrible choice. But thank you again, Danny.
Well, that gives us a lot of insight for people like myself who are also American Israelis living here. It's kind of difficult to balance that identity. So, Professor, now let's turn to our viewers' questions. Shlomo Aran is from Karnei Shomron and Israeli settlement in the West Bank, and he wants to talk about a possible solution for a Palestinian state.
Hi, my name is Shlomo Aran. I live in Karnei Shomron. In light of the fact that there can be no agreement with the Palestinian Authority, the problem of a one state for two nations is threatening us. The Palestinians use this as a tool to threaten us that we will lose either the democracy or the Jewish state. Therefore, my suggestion is that we will declare the A region as the Palestinian state in temporary borders. My questions are: 1. Can we do it legally? 2. Will it diminish our ability to defend ourselves against terror attacks from these territories?
Those are excellent questions, Shlomo. Let's remember what democracy really means. Occupations have occurred all over the world for many, many years, and yet countries have remained democratic. Take even the United States, for example. There are many, many people who live in Puerto Rico who are American citizens, but they don't get to vote in presidential elections, or the people who live in the District of Columbia, the capital of our country, who don't get to vote in congressional elections, do not have a voting member of Congress, or other places in the world which have areas that are part of the country but don't necessarily have full democratic vote. Look, it's not a good situation, and I think ultimately we're going to need to have a two-state solution. I don't think that Israel should be doing anything unilaterally at this point. I think it should be done as part of a peace process. I supported, and I was wrong to do so, I supported effort to unilaterally leave the Gaza Strip. That did not turn out well, because by ending the military presence of Israel in the Gaza Strip, it allowed for the building of terrorist bases, terrorist rockets, terror tunnels. I think Israel should never again do that. They can end the settlements. It was probably the right thing to do to end the settlements in the Gaza Strip, but not to end the military occupation. You don't end the military occupation until the other side gives up all claims of belligerency. And that's why there has to be a peace process. Look, you can have islands of peace amid oceans of warfare, and anything that could be done to give the Palestinians autonomy consistent with the security of Israel is a good thing. When I take students to Israel, or tell students to come to Israel, I tell them the first place to go should not be the Kotel or Yad Vashem, but Ramallah. Because when students who don't know go to Ramallah, their first reaction is, this is the occupation? This is a beautiful city. You don't see a single Israeli policeman or soldier. You see these incredible shops and beautiful cars, and everybody has fancy iPhones. There's no Israeli presence there to speak of at all. That could be the future of a Palestinian state, but right now Abbas is unwilling to sit down with Prime Minister Netanyahu and work out a peace. And I think the BDS and other movements are making it harder for Abbas to make the kinds of compromises necessary for a two-state solution. So although I commend you for thinking creatively about new ideas for resolving this conflict, I really think we have to go back to what was offered the Palestinians in 2001 by Ehud Barak and by President Clinton, and in 2008 by one of Israel's greatest prime ministers, Ehud Olmert, and re-offer the Palestinians a viable, demilitarized, democratic state. A one-state solution will be not a solution to the conflict, but a solution that will continue the conflict, because it will create a demographic war that will result in yet another Palestinian Islamic radical state in the place of Israel.
Professor, I noticed that today's caller, Shlomo, comes from Karnei Shomron, and if I'm not mistaken, wasn't this one of the first settlements set up by the Labor Party under former Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin? So technically speaking, do all settlements have the same legal status? If not, why does the world, especially the current American administration, seem to think that all settlements are illegal?
Well, first of all, there's no indication that any settlements are illegal. That's controversial. Uh, Reasonable people could disagree about that. For example, the Etzion bloc was part of what was going to be Israel until it was unlawfully taken from Israel during the War of Independence. I think there are other areas as well. I mean, Jerusalem was illegally captured by Jordan, East Jerusalem. So there are real disputes about the legality, and I don't think the issue should be resolved ultimately on legal grounds. I think it should be resolved on political, moral, and pragmatic grounds. And I would hope that good sense will prevail. And remember, I was very much an outsider when I opposed the Israeli settlement policies going back to the Labor administration. My mother's rabbi called me a traitor to the Jewish people when I signed on to an op-ed opposing the building of Elan Moreh, which was the first religious settlement in the West Bank. I didn't think the building of settlements in the West Bank was a good idea. Forget about the legality. I did think that the plan that had been proposed by several people after the Six-Day War, and that is changing Israel's borders unilaterally to achieve greater security and prevent renewed attacks of the kind that started the 67 war from Jordan, was a good idea. But I didn't think that settlement policy was conducive to peace. So, look, these are great disputes, and they should be resolved in a rational, logical manner. And the problem on university campuses today is you can't have a rational discussion of these issues. People just shout and scream and shout you down. And the level of discussion about the Middle East is at such a low academic level that it's extremely distressing. So I want to thank all of you for coming up with concrete suggestions. Let's continue to discuss this, and let's come up with a solution that is fair to everybody and is conducive to continued peace rather than continued belligerency.
Thanks, Professor. So, all right, I'm going to stop grilling you about the settlements, but let's keep our focus on a two-state solution, this time from a different perspective. Josh Elisha hails from both New York and Netanya, and he's concerned about the demographic changes around the world, specifically when it comes to the threat of growing radical Islam.
Hi, I'm Josh from Netanya in upstate New York. My question is this. In Israel, people are used to asking about the demographic time bomb. That's why we Israelis want a two-state solution. But the rest of the world is facing a similar problem and isn't even aware until after recent terror attacks. How should democracies deal with the growing radicalization among their Muslim population? And what do you say when leaders are afraid to use the words radical and Islam in the same sentence?
Well, thank you so much, Josh. First of all, let's be very clear. We should use the term radical and Islam in the same sentence. We should not allow perverse notions of political correctness that have, I think, plagued the Obama administration. Terrorism in the world today is primarily a function of radical Islamic jihadist approaches to the world. And we have to call it by its name if we're going to diagnose it properly. Yes, we have to acknowledge that the vast majority of Muslims in the world are not terrorists, and a majority of them probably don't support terrorism, though a very, very considerable number of Muslims who don't themselves participate in terrorism, according to polls, do support it. And there is an enormous amount of anti-Semitism within very large segments of the Muslim communities, not only in the Middle East, but in England and in France and in many, many other parts of the world. So it's very important to describe the phenomenon accurately and not to mince words about it. Demographic challenges are occurring all through Europe. Nobody could have predicted what the Syrian war was going to bring about. We were seeing demographic challenges even before that, with laborers coming into Turkey and then under the EU open border provisions circulating all through Europe. I think Brexit, the vote in England, was somewhat of a reaction to that. I think the success of Donald Trump in the Republican primaries was something of a reaction to that. Countries do have a right to define their immigration policy reasonably. They shouldn't do it by absolute prohibitions, the Trump notion of keeping all Muslims out. If that's what he actually advocates, it's unclear what his position actually is. would be completely wrong and inconsistent with the spirit of the American Constitution. But imposing restrictions based on profiling people, not racial profiling, but profiling them, travel records, history of radicalism, support for certain imams who advocate radicalism, all of that's fair game in a country trying to decide what its demographic feel and look will be like. Some countries are extremes in that regard. Iceland won't let anybody in, essentially, grant them citizenship. That's true of many other countries, and well, some other countries are too permissive. Let's remember, as Jews, particularly those of us watching this show who are Jews, that one of the reasons the Holocaust claims so many victims because the United States adopted a racist policy at the time of the First World War and closed our borders. My parents, grandparents, others' grandparents who came to America, my grandparents came in 1889, then again in 1906, but others couldn't come in 1920, 1922, 1923. America was closed to Jews, and that resulted in so many of them being trapped in Eastern Europe where they perished in the Shoah. So we have to, as Jews, be open-minded about immigration policy, but we have to balance morality and pragmatism and insist that countries that open their borders make sure they take measures so as to reduce the likelihood that people who come in will engage in terrorism.
It's a very, very good point, Professor Dershowitz. Now, moving on to our next question, David Ladarini from Fort Walton Beach, Florida, wants us to turn our focus to international law, one of your specialties. So Israel has become a testing ground when it comes to the laws of war and armed conflict. Let's hear what David has to ask about this sensitive subject.
Hi, Alan. I'm David Ladarini from Fort Walton Beach, Florida, and was an F-4 Phantom aviator for 15 years. From my combat experience in Southeast Asia and having trained Israeli pilots, I know that nobody is more careful than your air crews about avoiding what we call collateral damage or harming uninvolved citizens. But the world never understands and always rushes to judge them as baby killers. Hamas and Hezbollah violate the Geneva Convention by firing from densely populated areas as well as schools and hospitals. So, do we need to change the laws of war? Or simply make the world understand that one side, Israel, upholds these laws while the other side violates them and endangers its own people?
Well, thank you, David, and thank you for your service to world peace and to protecting us. It's a very, very good question. International law has very questionable basis in theories of legality. Most of international law today comes from the mind of hard left academics sitting in their ivory towers. Most international law has not been subject to ratification by treaty. It's called customary international law, and it should be subject to change. Much of the law of war grew out of the experiences at the end of the First and Second World Wars where civilian populations were targeted, and those are very good aspects of the laws of war and the laws of humanitarianism. But they have to change because the terrorist groups like Hamas and Hezbollah and ISIS and others use international law to their military advantage. As you say, they hide among civilians, fire rockets at civilians, in the expectation, perhaps even the hope, that their own babies will be killed. I call it the dead baby strategy or the CNN strategy, and Hamas brags about it. They're ready to show their dead babies who they purposely put in harm's way in order to make Israel look bad. International law has to recognize that when terrorists hide among civilians and democracies respond by trying to kill the terrorists, and in the process of it, kill some innocent civilians, that every one of those civilian deaths must be attributable in law and in morality to the terrorists who have hidden their rockets and fired their rockets from within civilian areas. You know that during the Israel-Palestine conflict, fewer people have been killed on both sides than in any other comparable war during any other period of time. The death rate is extraordinarily low for a conflict of this nature. And yet for Black Lives Matter or other organizations that are components of Black Lives Matter to use the horrible word genocide, a word that was coined to describe the desire to kill every Jew in the world by the Nazis, is a reflection of anti-Semitism. And we cannot sit and tolerate Black Lives Matters, which does good things in alerting the public to excesses of police violence and force in the United States. We cannot let radicals within Black Lives Matter hijack that movement and falsely accuse Israel of the blood libel of genocide. So we have to fight back. And I have severed all of my relations with Black Lives Matter until and unless they rescind their platform calling Israel a country that is guilty of genocide and apartheid. And yes, international law must adapt to the new realities, and it's a great question. But even if it doesn't, Israel will continue to lead the world in reducing civilian casualties by all the tactics it has employed. And even if it's not rewarded by the international community, those who know, those in the military know that no country in history has ever taken more precautions or more efforts to try to reduce civilian casualties on both sides. So thanks for your great question.
All right, turning to a completely different topic and one of the more interesting questions, in my opinion, we're going to focus on women's rights. Madeline Hansen from the UK wants to discuss women's rights in Middle Eastern countries.
Hello, my name is Madeline Hansen, and my question is this. Numerous Middle Eastern countries have laws against helping rape victims or unmarried women from getting medical assistance giving birth. Isn't this against universal human rights?
Well, Madeline, you put your finger on a very important question. Look, let's understand that historically, rape has been a weapon of war. It was used in the former Yugoslavia most recently. It has been used historically. I mean, you even remember the terms from your history books or from plays that the victors rape and pillage. Rape was a part of what was acceptable warfare, and impregnating enemy women so as to make them bear the children of the victor was a horrible, horrible form of warfare. And so international law and humanitarian law must recognize that rape must be prohibited, and also that victims of rape have to be treated like victims. And if a woman has been impregnated by her rapist, she has an absolute right to terminate that pregnancy. No woman has the obligation to bear the child of a rapist or to bear the child of an enemy who has perhaps killed her husband or killed her family members. It's the cruelest form of making the harm continue beyond one generation. And so international law must recognize the seriousness of rape and mistreatment of women. Look, we will never have peace in the world until women are treated with absolute equality in every phase of life. Israel led the way, the first country in history ever to have a leader, a prime minister, who was a woman and not related to any other prime minister or leader of the country. Golda Meir, the first person in modern history to have that distinction. And Israel leads the way in feminism. It could do better. Every country can do better. And yet it gets criticized by feminists, by gay rights activists, by others for imperfections that no other country gets criticized for. So Israel should continue to lead the way in women's rights and in other rights, and serve as a light unto the nations in the way it treats women in its society.
Now, Professor Dershowitz, I want to take Madeline's question a little further. One particular aspect of international law that really interests me is the way Israel, which is easily the most progressive country in the Middle East regarding the status of women, is singled out incorrectly and unfairly, while true abuses by others are totally ignored. Isn't this unfair not only to Israel, but more importantly to women everywhere, and particularly in Arab countries?
Well, I've always argued, and it's a great question, that the real victims of the double standard are not Israel. Israel can fight back. The real victim of the double standard are the people who are not being taken seriously in other countries. The idea that Iran is the leader of a women's group within the United Nations, or that Saudi Arabia is telling Israel how to treat women, is so absurd that it doesn't even pass the giggle test. And yet the international community, particularly the UN, specializes in putting the worst abusers in charge of trying to prevent abuse. And the answer is always to blame Israel. Look, I think one of the greatest problems that the Arab world faces today is its focus on Israel and condemning Israel. it provides an excuse for the Arab world not to deal with its own problems. There's an interesting article. The entire magazine of the New York Times last week was devoted to why the Arab Spring failed. And I didn't think it was a particularly insightful article, but it had a few insights that were very important. And that is the focus on Israel as an excuse for the Arab world not doing anything to increase the goodness of life for its own people has been one of the great reasons for the failure, not only of the Arab Spring, but for the failure of Arab countries in the Middle East. And they just have to stop obsessing about Israel and start focusing on their own problems. And the double standard is just another excuse for failing to focus on the real problems that prevent progress in the Middle East.
Absolutely. Well, that's all the time we have for today, unfortunately. Thanks so much, Professor, for joining us. I also want to thank our guests, including Ambassador Dani Ayalon. If you'd like Professor Dershowitz to answer your questions, go to iltv.tv or our Facebook page and submit them. We can't wait until you'll join us again next week.